Here's a Bigfoot story from Jim. 20 years ago, when I was 48 years old, I was hunting in Palestine, Texas, that's southeast of Fort Worth. It was over 10,000 acres of hardwood forest that was leased by Texas Parks and Wildlife. On this trip, it was me and a few of my friends, and we ate and geared up for a day of bow hunting before heading out at 4:30 a.m. I wanted to get there as quickly as I could because I was going to put up my tree climbing stand. The trail was bordered by old-growth oaks and pine trees and thickets. With nothing more than a lamp on my head, I didn't have much to identify any strange sounds around me. And there were definitely some strange sounds. I was halfway to my spot when I heard something in the thicket next to me that sounded like someone or something heavy lifting itself off the ground. A cool chill ran through me as my mind raced to identify the animal that could have made that sound. It was way too big to be a human. Maybe it was a wild hog. It had only been a couple of days since I had come across a team of hogs on my way out, and I had to hide behind a pine tree. I decided to take 3 or 4 side steps to my right. Whatever was in the brush did the same, except that its footsteps sounded louder. What was worse, it snorted in my direction. I'm 6'3" and I weigh 212 pounds, but the sound that came from inside that thicket was bigger and taller than me. Every hair on my body stood on end. Oh hell, I thought, what is this thing in front of me? All I had to protect myself was my compound bow and 5 arrows. I figured it wasn't much, but I was going to fight to the death if I had to. Slowly and deliberately, I pulled one of my arrows from the quiver and brought it to the string and had the bow in firing position. I did another 3 or 4 side steps to my left, and the thing on the other side of the brush did exactly the same thing. I squinted and stared into the thicket in front of me. I wanted to see what was there, but my light wasn't powerful enough, and the vegetation was too dense. My heart was pounding enough that I was sure it was physically audible as my mind ran through the scenarios, all of which appeared to end in my death. With no other choice, I stared straight ahead of me. The bow was still in firing position, and I was doing my best to remain calm as I said, "If you don't hurt me, I won't hurt you." And then I slowly turned to my right and began walking away. I looked back over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything, no heavy breathing, no footsteps. As quickly as I could, I managed to get to my tree and I climbed up, and I hunted the rest of the day without incident. After that, though, I made a point of not heading out to my stand until daylight. The next year, Texas Parks and Wildlife gave up the hunting lease. We heard that it was too expensive and that the land had turned into a private club. I had never heard of Bigfoot when that happened. It wasn't until a couple of years ago when I began to listen to your channel that I began to find myself wondering, was that Bigfoot I heard that day? Oh man, that is a cool story. Probably was Bigfoot. What do you really think? Now that you've really thought about it, are you wondering if it was Bigfoot or are you pretty sure? I'd love to hear what you think now. Thanks for the story, Jim. I appreciate it. Okay, here's an email about a haunting that I thought was pretty cool. My wife and I are into the paranormal. My wife is actually an empath. So is a friend of ours. There are many types of empaths. Man, I have trouble saying that word. Empaths. There are many types of empaths with various combinations of abilities. Our friend is one of the most empathic people. I'm sorry. Our friend is one of the most empathic people I've ever met. Man, there's too many empaths words in this story. She's also the smartest person I know. This woman has been on several paranormal shows and still does guest appearances, and she is an accomplished writer with several published books. Our empathic friend and her significant other purchased an old house. It was built in 1968, and they fixed it up and they used it as an Airbnb. It's a retreat and a venue to hold seminars and host storytelling sessions. We all live in Medina, Ohio, but the house is located in Oberlin. When they started working on it, several of us got together and went over to help clean and paint, and it didn't take us long to figure out that it was haunted. It began when I was painting in a back room on the upper level. I stepped backwards to look at the wall to see if everything looked okay, but when I went to take another step, I felt a hand firmly on my back that stopped me from taking another step. I looked behind me to see who had come in the room, but I was alone. The only thing behind me was a ladder that was lying on the floor, and if I hadn't been stopped, I probably would have tripped over it. Things escalated from there. We began to hear voices coming from rooms when we knew those rooms were empty. Sometimes we would hear full-blown conversations. They were loud enough to be heard, but never loud enough to be understood. And then we began to see shadow figures walking from room to room. That was followed by knocks and doors being opened and closed. One night, after we had finished working and were gathered together taking a break before leaving, a friend asked our empathic friend when she had gotten a dog and where was she keeping it. Our empathic friend laughed and said, "So you see it too." Apparently it had been seen multiple times, and since it never responded to anyone, it was most likely a residual event. Residuals are like movies on a loop, playing over and over again. No one ever went into the basement except for my wife and our empathic friend. They both agreed that there was something or someone down there, but they could not pick up on anything other than maybe an old man. I decided to bring a few voice motion activated digital recorders, and I set them up down there. I'm game for anything like that. I guess I'm not smart enough to be afraid. I was down there for half an hour, but I didn't get anything except me rambling on the recorders and asking questions. I decided to try another tactic, so I set up the only 2 recorders that would power up at that point. And then I said, "I'm leaving. You can talk if you want or not. It's up to you." And what I got was the craziest EVP ever. Screams. It was just screams, but it was bone-chilling and horrifying and heart-stopping, and it was almost demonic sounding. Listening to it is not for the faint of heart. That's the end of the email, and he gave a link, but I did not copy it with this email, but someone else had heard it, and they wrote to me and said it's basically screams from the basement. That's the EVP, and I'm sorry to the writer that I did not save that link, but I just copied the text from these emails and I paste them in a Word file and I read them, and that's how this went. But that's a really cool story. These haunted house stories give me the willies. I don't know about y'all, but there is something demonic about it. There is a book that kind of suggests and tells us what happens to us when we die, and we don't get to stay here. I think the only entities that get to stay here are demonic entities. So and that's just my belief. It's my opinion. I'm not saying you're wrong if you think people get to stay, their spirits get to stay. I don't want to get in a tangle with anybody about a silly subject like that. But to me, they seem demonic. But I've never seen one, so what do I know? I have no idea. But it was a really cool story, and I appreciate the writer, so thank you. Okay, here's a short email that crams in Bigfoot and Dogman. The event takes place in Arkansas. The writer's name is Jeremy. Here's what he writes. In 1985, I was 12 years old, living on my grandfather's farm in Arkansas, and to my young mind, I was living the dream. My grandfather had a 3-wheeler that I rode all over the place. There was something about tearing down those old dirt roads that made me feel free and ready to face the world. It was on one of those occasions when I was headed down a dirt road on a three-wheeler that I had my first experience. At the time, I didn't know what it was. I thought it was the biggest wolf I'd ever seen. The problem with that was that there were no wolves in Arkansas, at least at that time. All I knew was that it stayed with me no matter how fast I drove. It stayed inside the tree line, so it was hard to get a good look at it, but it had to be a wolf. What else could it have been? After a mile, it ran off into the woods. Arkansas didn't have wolves, and looking back, I now realize that I saw a dog man that day. I live in Missouri now and have for several years. In 2015, I was at a buddy's house. It was mid-spring, and we were there for a barbecue. The adults were in the living room playing cards and having a few beers when my buddy's daughter, who was in the backyard playing, started screaming at the top of her lungs. Instinctively, we all jumped up and ran to the back door with my buddy leading the way, and he stopped dead in his tracks in the doorway, but with three of us behind him, momentum shoved him out of the way. I was the second one out the door, which gave me just enough time to see my first Bigfoot as it disappeared into the trees. His daughter ran up the stairs and then threw herself into her daddy's arms, and he scooped her up and he carried her inside. Back in the house, we each grabbed a hunting rifle or a shotgun and went back out to the general area it had been. And we found a spot in the grass where it must have been sitting and watching the little girl. It looked like it had crawled up to that point, but there were 5 to 6 foot strides through the long grass where it made its retreat. There was roughly 25 yards between the tree line and the back fence. We knew it would be long gone, so we went back into the house. By then, his daughter had calmed down enough to tell the story. She said that she was playing when a big man stood up out of the tall grass and stepped over the fence and started coming for her. He just stepped over it, she said. That fence was 3 feet tall and he stepped over it like it was nothing. That was when my friend explained why he had stopped dead in his tracks. He had locked eyes with the thing for a moment, and then it stepped back across the fence. That is when we shoved him out of the way and I watched it disappear into the trees. That was my first experience with Bigfoot, but there are others. Oh, that's cool, man. Why didn't you include those in this email, brother? Jeremy is his name. And Jeremy, if you've got some more, if you haven't already sent them, make sure and send them to me because I'd love to share them with the audience. Otherwise, thank you for this one. It was a good one. This writer doesn't give a name, but it's a story about Bigfoot, and he claims it's true. 33 years ago, when I was stationed in Colorado, I had a friend who was a bow hunter. While we were in Colorado and before we had to leave on deployment, he wanted to hunt for elk. So one day we drove up to check out a valley that he had been researching. We headed out on Thursday evening to a valley near Fairplay. There were 2 other valleys near Weston Pass in case we didn't see any elk on the first spot, but Dave wanted to start near Fairplay first. Since we didn't leave until Thursday evening, it was already dark when we arrived, which is why we spent the night sleeping in the back of my truck. It didn't take us long to get a move on the next morning. We hiked a good 30 minutes or more up a fire lane road before stopping so Dave could check his topo map and compass. Once he was sure of where we were, he pointed out the valley on the map and he drew a line with his finger indicating the route that we should take up the hill to our right. It would lead us to an outcropping of rock where we could overlook the entire valley. Well, I trusted Dave to make the right calls. He'd been there before, so when he dropped his backpack halfway up the hill and said that we would camp there that night, I dropped my pack too. And then we had an MRE and we hiked the rest of the way up the hill. The outcropping was exactly where he said it would be, and the view of the valley was more than I could have expected. I had a pair of field glasses and Dave had a spotting scope to use when the elk came out to feed. And while we waited for that moment, and with the cool breeze blowing across the valley and the long trek behind us, we decided it would be a good time and place to take a nap. Sometime later, and I had no idea how long it was, I woke up to Dave tapping me. I looked up at him and then turned and looked out to where he was pointing. At the lower end of the valley were over a dozen elk feeding with calves and 2 nice bulls. Jackpot, I thought. I was too wrapped up in watching the elk grazing in the valley to notice much else. It was such a nice scene. It was tranquil and peaceful to me. And when Dave started poking me again, this time much harder, I was irritated. I looked up at him with what I'm sure was an angry expression that he ignored as he gestured to the trees across from us. "In the trees behind the 2 rocks," he whispered. I looked over to where he was pointing, but I didn't see anything. I was about to turn back to him and tell him so when a movement caught my attention. It was big and black and standing next to a tree, and it was looking at the elk just like we were. I stammered out something like, "What the hell?" before Dave motioned for me to be quiet. Not knowing what else to do, I shut my mouth and turned back around, and I watched that thing stand there for a minute, and then it moved forward to the next tree and a little closer to the elk. It was walking on 2 legs just like a human. Another minute passed, and it slowly moved to the next tree, and it crouched down. It didn't move out of that position for several minutes, and then it stood up straight and turned and walked back into the trees. I remembered the elk then. The 2 bulls had placed themselves between the cows and where the creature had been. The wind had changed direction and was blowing toward them. They must have caught its scent. Dave tapped me on the shoulder and motioned for us to leave, and we walked back down to our packs without saying a word. He picked up his pack and he said, "Let's go." I grabbed mine and we made our way down to the truck, still not speaking. Once we had our packs stowed in the back of the truck, he turned to me and asked for the keys. That was unusual. I generally did the driving, but I didn't feel like something I should argue with him about, so I handed them over to him, and in silence we drove down the Fire Lane Road. And once we got to the main road, he pulled over and sat there. And finally I asked, "What the hell was that?" He kept looking straight ahead for a minute. I didn't think he was going to answer me. But finally he said, "It was Bigfoot, and don't ever tell anyone what we saw." The drive back to the base was as quiet as the trip down the mountain. And I couldn't say what was going through Dave's mind. I don't really know what was going through my own mind. It's a startling thing to see something walk out of a myth and into reality. It plays twister with your brain cells. When we got to the NCO club, he pulled into the parking lot, and I reached for the door, but he put his hand on my arm and looked hard into my eyes. And in a slow, cold voice that I barely recognized, he said, "Do not ever talk to me or anyone else about what we saw up there. Do you understand? If word gets out, they'll think we're lying. We don't need that. Yes, we know what we saw, and I'll never go there again, but this has to be between us." "But," I tried to say, and he cut me off. "No, I don't want to talk about it. Do you hear me?" I nodded, and we got out, and we went inside and had a beer. After that night, Dave was never the same. He was distant and deep, and his demeanor had completely changed. True to his word, he never went back into the mountains again. And a couple of months later, he deployed overseas, and I never heard from him again. Someone told me that he retired to the Virgin Islands. Heck, I was glad for him. I still think about that day. I even went back there 4 years later when I got back from my own deployment. I needed some closure. I don't think I got it, but being there helped to cement the reality of the day. We actually saw a Bigfoot. I know we saw a Bigfoot. A large bipedal male Bigfoot, and I will never forget it. What a well put together story. This guy recounted his story perfectly, and man, was his buddy serious. I don't know if I could. If I saw something like that, I just don't know if I could keep that quiet. I think I would be telling everyone. Of course, I'm kind of a blabbermouth anyway. Sometimes I think I annoy people with, I don't know. I just look at things in awe and wonder like I did when I was a kid. And when I see something unusual, I tell people about it. And I want them to share in the awe and wonder that I have as an adult. I don't know, in this culture and this society, and maybe it has been forever, nobody likes to listen to a blabbermouth. So all that to say, I don't know. I kind of understand why people won't tell anyone for fear of being labeled a kook, you know? But I'm not sure I would care if people thought I was a kook. I just don't think I would care. I would just be real serious and adamant. And I'm telling you, if I saw one and I told the story, my story would never change. I mean, you just don't forget all that stuff. You don't forget it when you see it. And there's probably details you miss, but a lot of them you pick up, and a lot of details people pick up are unusual details. I'm not going to go into a long explanation of how I think about this, but it is a myth walking into reality when people see these things. So this was a wonderfully wrote story. It was a very good story, and it was about the fear and the weight that this man carries when he saw something that was supposed to be a myth. And it's a story that a lot of people carry. So thank you for the story. I really appreciate it. All right, that's going to wind this one up. Hey, I wanted to tell y'all before you leave, I have been uploading archived stories that I did 3 or 4 years ago on the podcast. They're all called Archive 1, 2, 3, 4. And here's what's different about them. I've kind of remastered the audio, and there is no music. There is no, like in this podcast, you know, I give a little bit of talk. I talk about it after I read the story. But I'm not doing that in these podcasts. So the people who enjoy just not hearing me run my mouth, but you like the stories and you like the way I tell them, then you can listen to that on the podcast network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can listen to it on Audible, and you can also hear those on Rumble. It's a different way of presenting these stories, and I've wanted to do it for a long time, but I'm not going to do it on YouTube because I've already done the stories on YouTube, but these are just remastered, no talking, no nothing. And they're usually under 30 minutes, usually 15 to 20 minutes long. Some of them are 5 minutes long, but I've enjoyed doing it. I've got about 40 of them up. Probably have 50 up by the end of this week, and more podcasts coming. I've been working on the job and been away from podcasting, but I'm slap out of work again, and I'm going to be putting out as many podcasts as I can until I pick up some more work. All right, hope you guys have a good week, and we'll see you on the next one. Won't be too long, maybe a day or two. Love you guys. See you on the next one.